ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Mighty Van Halen podcast once again. I am your host, Tommy London, along with my buddy Tor. We love to deliver these shows to you and Van Halen fans alike worldwide here, and we thank you as always for joining us. We have a very special guest today, Greg Renoff, who has written two amazing books in my collection and Tor's collection. The autobiography for Ted Templeman, who's produced all the Van Halen albums with David Lee Roth, and Van Halen Rising, which is a fantastic book. And these are both must-haves for any Van Halen fan. And thank you so much for being here with us today, Greg. It's awesome.
Hey, thank you guys for having me on. I'm excited to be an early adopter, early visitor to the podcast, and you guys are off to a great start.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Hey, so just to kick things off, and we're just getting right into it today, just because we have so many questions for you.
Sure.
You're the bona fide VH expert, and we're going to sort of wring you dry today. I hope you don't mind. But let's start at the beginning. Like,
sure.
What was your introduction to Van Halen? Like, where, why, and where, and how? Let's give us the basics.
Okay, so I grew up in suburban New Jersey. I graduated high school in 1987. So I was
Say no more.
Prime,
that says it all
exactly.
Right there.
Yeah, prime, so for like that prime peak Van Halen fandom, I sort of hit that tail end of that with 1984. So yeah, I always tell people I certainly had heard Pretty Woman on the radio, and I was like, oh, that was a cool song, but I was like 12 or whatever, and then I ended up scalping a ticket from literally Fast Times at Ridgemont High thing. A kid behind me in homeroom in my high school in New Jersey had a ticket to the 1984 tour, and it was sold out. I mean, it sold out like the next day it was sold out, or that night It was sold out, no tickets. And I'll spare the details, but it was I bought the ticket for $50, which at the time my mom was like, basically like, here's your checking account, you're responsible now. And then it was like, what did you do? You withdraw that, but in retrospect, of course, it was a great investment. And so I went to the show, and it just blew my mind. I saw them at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. It was
April 3rd, show. 1984.
I saw them. I saw them on the second. And so I saw the first night, and they were, unbelievable. I don't need to tell anyone who's listening to this podcast what it was like. It was so loud, and it was just so mind boggling. I mean, one of the things that was kind of funny was, I'd been to a couple of shows before, but nothing like Van Halen. And I remember Roth was like, basically like cursing and telling people like, fuck the rest of the show, let's go get drunk across the street. And I was like, you could do that? It was sort of like at the time where on broadcast TV, you couldn't curse and stuff like that. But I was like, wow, you could, and it was just, the whole thing was so over the top with Roth, just being able to control the audience. I mean, to me, beyond the Van Halen, the Eddie Van Halen factor and the whole Van Halen thing, which was so incredible, but just the way that Roth could absolutely control the audience was just incredible. I mean, I still have never seen a performer do that the way he did that night. And after that, I was a fan for life. I bought the 1984 album, but then I started going back and buying the other records. And so that was, the magical summer of 1984, MTV, Martha Quinn, the whole 9 yards. That was all, Mark Goodman, the whole Van Halen thing was up and running, particularly on MTV, but on the radio. And then, so that was sort of my beginning. And later on saw the Hagar tours, saw the Roth, Eat 'Em and Smile tour twice in New Jersey. And, I just kind of went along with my my fandom and did my thing, and just kept my education going. And so ended up going to grad school and getting a PhD in history, which is the other kind of twist to this whole plot. And that was sort of what led me to do the books eventually.
That's awesome. So was Van Halen your number one band growing up? Were there other bands you were into that brought you to Van Halen, or maybe Van Halen opened the door for?
What interesting, like I don't know if you guys remember, I'm sure you guys do actually remember that in the 81, 80, there was the whole Apocalypse Now, Doors, Legacy thing, which really became Morrison was on the cover of Rolling Stone. And for whatever reason in my elementary school, I don't know, the Doors tapes were being passed around, and I started listening to the Doors, and I actually, that was really the first band that I really, really got into. And, that was, in some ways with the whole LA sound thing, which was obviously the psychedelic era and the whole thing. But, when I started to read about Van Halen's beginning, it was like, oh, they played the whiskey like the Doors, they played the whiskey, and sort of understanding the whole LA scene as being just such fertile soil for growing so many amazing bands over the years. So, it didn't lead me necessarily to my Van Halen fandom, but it definitely made me, Van Halen came out of LA. Well, of course, it didn't come out of I don't want to mention any other cities that are, but there are other cities in the United States. You'd be like, what? No, there's no way that band came out of that city. Obviously, LA, New York, Chicago would be like the big, the big, particularly at LA and New York. So it kind of like made sense. You're like, oh, this makes sense about that. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of the Doors was the first band that I really, really, bought the tapes and had that. And then Van Halen came along and kind of replaced them in some ways.
Right. And at some point you felt so passionate, as we've talked about this on other episodes, where as a fan, and especially pre-internet days, you want to get closer to the band. You want to do, how can I, and a lot of guitar players especially will build their own Eddie guitar and paint it and do all of that stuff. And for you, it was, I'm going to write a book, right? Like, tell us about that decision, or how you came to write Van Halen Rising.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, so I was but I one of the things I started doing fairly early on in my fandom, and so it should have been 84, was trading tapes. I've talked to other guys who did that too, and actually, and now have become friends with some of the guys I sort of traded tapes with through the mail. It was like you went in the back of Circus Magazine and it said like bootleg albums, and I actually one of my broke prize possessions was I got a copy, like a lot of people did back then, of a copy of the Van Halen 1984 tour show from Montreal on video, right. Montreal. So at that point it was like, it's so funny now, a very good copy is on YouTube and I couldn't watch any time, but it was like third generation, and it was but it was very similar, if not almost exactly the same, to the show I saw in New Jersey. So that was actually in some ways really cool too. And that was part of building my interest in Van Halen history. I would get tapes from 78. There was a tape that came out that was kind of a classic bootleg that was recorded in Paris, and they played an early version of Mean Street called Voodoo Queen, which never made it to a record, obviously, until 81, and it had different lyrics. And so you're like, oh, they had other earlier songs, and you get little bits of demos, a little bit of the Gene Simmons demo was being traded back then. So that's sort of, as a guy who was very history minded, I was raised by a professor, and it just sort of was my way of thinking of things about history and about the origins of things. And so that was kind of a good, I'd read some of the Van Halen books that were sort of the more popular, like fan driven, cheapy paperbacks in the 80s and stuff. Yes. And but by the time I got to be a professional historian, my whole thought process at that time, when I started doing Van Halen research or whatever, it was just for fun to blow off some steam. It was really, my day job. I was a professor at the time, was teaching at a university in the Midwest, and I just wanted to, do something for fun one summer. And I just started to snowball into I talked to a guy who was a club owner of a place called the Rock Corporation in Van Nuys, which was the club where Van Halen played wet t-shirt contests. It was definitely one of the pioneering clubs in LA that actually had a wet t-shirt contest as come to our bar tonight. There's going to be a wet t-shirt contest. And, hearing those stories from him, and Roth had talked a little bit about that in some interviews. I was like, holy, there's something really here. And then got to talk to some guys in Pasadena who either roadied for them or held backyard parties. And I sort of realized that there was a book there. And in particularly, one thing I'd really want to emphasize was that back then you'd go on Wikipedia and there'd be 3 paragraphs or 5 at the most 3 paragraphs about Van Halen's beginnings. It'd be the brothers came from the Netherlands. They came to America. They met David Lee Roth. The band was called Mammoth. They became Van Halen. They played in bars and played in clubs. They played the whiskey. It might mention Gene Simmons. It probably mentioned Ted Templeman, but none of the dates were right. And it was just sort of this black hole of time. And, I started to really get driven by that, wanting to fill that gap. I kind of, no offense to the brothers I never thought they were going to. I'm glad Alex did a book at that time. I really thought Alex would probably never do a book. Eddie didn't seem to be particularly motivated to do a rock bio. And I really wanted to try to fill, not replace their perspective on things, but basically try to document this history, especially because, at the time I'm 56, a lot of the guys who were they were older. They were and you sort of realize that this is perishable. Not that they were on their deathbeds, but it's just, if you don't do it, 20 years later, half those people may have been passed. And so I just wanted to sort of document how hard those guys worked to make it too, because that was really what came through when talking to so many people who were, I talked to over 200 people to do the Van Halen Rising book. And that included, just a lot of guys who were just went to high school. It was you have no idea how hard these guys work. They would play 4 or 5 nights a week. They played at Gazzarri's. They play at, biker bars. They'd play at backyard parties. And just, beyond the fun of that, how fun those stories were, it was just sort of, you realize they weren't really making any money. They were just busting their ass doing this because they loved it. And honestly, 1976, 1977 comes around. They late 76 before Gene, they probably didn't have a super lot of hope that they were going to get a deal. I'm sure they were, as optimistic as they could be, but at that point they'd been at it for a couple of years and they had not gotten a record deal after playing everywhere across Los Angeles before Gene came along and then Ted, and that's a different story.
After all the interviews for Van Halen Rising, what was the biggest myth about the early VH there that turned out to be wrong?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. What was the biggest myth? I think for me, the biggest eye opener was how Roth was perceived. Roth has always cultivated an image, and rightly so, of being a superstar, ultimate frontman. And so when I started to hear these stories from guys who were fans of the brothers band Mammoth, which was a power trio at the time, and then had a keyboard player, I won't get into the weeds on that. But when Roth was brought in, and again, we understand this was like their local high school circuit of like friends. So we're talking like, however many 300-400 people who would have been like into their band at the time, like playing in Pasadena. They really weren't playing in other towns. We're like, this is a disaster. Like, why are you hiring this guy? This guy sucks. He can't sing. He's basically, there was a lot of opposition, and even to really see how driven and how confident, and I don't even know if confidence is the right word, but just basically how single-minded Roth was and how much more I admired him after seeing, like, when you heard that from people. One of the best stories I heard was from a guy who said, like, he went to one of the first parties that Roth was the front man. And again, it was not very, even Roth talks about that in his book. It was not very together. They were like, it was just not great. Like they were still learning each other and hadn't really fit together. And this guy, friend of Eddie's, went up to him and said, "You got to get rid of this guy." And Eddie turned around and pointed to him and said, "You don't understand. We need this guy." Like the brothers had sort of realized that, this is what we need. He has talent. It's just, it needs work basically. And they had his back basically. And that was, really made me admire those guys. And then also admire Roth for kind of standing in the face of that sort of like mockery basically, and sort of be like, oh, I'm going to hang with this and continue to build into something better rather than going, I'm not cut out for this. Like a lot of people would be like, you get just basically like, when the band's fans, and again, understand we're talking about a few hundred people, we're not talking like tens of thousands of people, but when the fan base, the guys who basically pay to get in the parties to see you, are basically of the opinion that this was a terrible mistake and they should get rid of you as the singer, it's just, it can't be like a great feeling to kind of go up there. But he always like just got up there and did his thing, and so that really made me admire Roth. So the myth of like Roth was like this magical front man from the beginning of the eyes everybody, it wasn't true. But of course, he probably was doing the similar stuff that he would do later that people would cheer, but basically to them, Mammoth was like this dark Black Sabbath. The guys, they all wear flannels. Their bass, it was just not a flashy thing. It was like those guys getting up there in jeans and flannel shirts and then playing like Black Sabbath and like Cream, perfect songs. They didn't have a guy who was wearing, just
satin
outrageous outfits,
right,
satin, like literally like satin, all this stuff, like, top hat and cane, all this stuff that was like kind of glitter, like, basically like the Alice Cooper glitter thing. Roth, not exactly, but you guys get it. He was like more influenced by that type of look, and to have that vibe be brought to Van Halen for what it was at the time, that was very eye-opening to see, like, oh, there was actually, Roth had to basically, come into his own as the front man of Van Halen and be kind of accepted by their local Pasadena fans.
For sure. I mean, that's the first line of defense, is you got to get past your friends, right? You got to convince somebody that you're worth watching. And let's just take into account that, so you've got guys coming up to Eddie and Al saying, hey, you got to get rid of this guy. What were the ladies saying, right? The ladies weren't saying that, right? Dave was bringing the ladies.
No, and that was the other interesting too. So Roth had this band called, Red Ball Jet, which was kind of an also ran against Van Halen, but they always were kind of a thing that people wanted to go see. It was Roth was the show, and he had four guys behind him basically playing like rhythm and blues or like early rock and roll or whatever, Stones, and like playing like Chuck Berry songs. And I mean, Roth always drew attention, and Roth definitely brought the female angle. And that was the thing too. Like the brothers really saw it as, it seems like the early version of Van Halen was just like, the show is the music, right? What you go to, and that's why they had so many, like, especially male musician friends, were like, people were blown away. Like they played entire sides of Live at Leeds. They play the whole first side, every single song. And again, it was, it was a shorter album. It's not like that CD today, but it was like, 15, 18 minutes or whatever it was. They'd play that whole thing note for note. And then they'd play, a Cream song from Wheels of Fire or something like that. And they would, Eddie was singing. And so that was that was the sort of the sell for that. And then have this guy come in who's like more flashy and stuff. Roth, but they knew, the brothers recognized it. Eddie knew that he wasn't up for singing. Alex could see it too, that they weren't up. Eventually he was like, yeah, you can't do it, right? You're not going to be able to do this. And even if Roth was not Ian Gillan, or, I mean, that's the thing, right? You're comparing him to these guys who in the era, like that was the type of stuff Roth was trying to sing. And clearly Roth's not really cut out to sing like, just sing like Ian Gillan. It's not his style, covering Deep Purple songs. But, Roth won people over, and Roth, yes, the girls definitely were drawn to Van Halen because Roth, more girls for sure.
And you work with what you've got, and you lean into, your attributes. Let me ask you this. If you can remember, I know that Van Halen Rising came out a little while ago, but are there any stories that you recall that for whatever reason, space, time, etc., any stories that stick out that didn't make it into the book that are noteworthy?
I mean, there was one which I never was able to verify, which at the end of the day, I couldn't, for obvious reasons, when you hear the story, I couldn't really like press too hard. There was supposedly a girl who agreed to hire Van Halen on the and pay whatever amount of money, but she demanded to sleep with Roth, and supposedly that happened, which again is like, in retrospect, is like, well, sure, like of course that probably happened, but actually a guy I interviewed was actually like, I know the girl, and I was like, yeah, I don't, if she, here's my number. If she want to pass along, I'm not going to like call up and be like, so I'm going to interview you for my book. So you tell me about like, I didn't want to like walk it up to that to be, because it may have been something she's like, yeah, like I have like 5 kids now and I'm not
right.
I'm not really happy. But I, that was one thing that I, in theory, I would have liked to do a deep dive on that and get all the details. But, there was all sorts of like, the one story about Eddie overdosing, which actually Alex ended up talking about in his book, and Eddie had talked about in a couple of radio interviews where he took PCP instead of cocaine. That was something that I had heard from a couple of guys who were there, and one person in particular, a woman who was there, who helped get Eddie into a car to take him to the hospital. I mean, that was probably the most, shocking thing that had heard firsthand from people. And again, Eddie had talked about that in an interview in the 90s where he said, I thought it was coke and it was PCP, and I like had a seizure basically. And it's crazy. I mean, I think about what could have happened, because he was apparently was just, was like completely seizing from that. And so, but yeah, the girl story would have been the one that would have been like, just, like,
Hey, let me ask you this, because,
sure.
I'm not a writer. I've never written a book. I don't think I probably ever will. I don't think it's in my DNA.
I don't recommend it. It doesn't make you any money, really. You don't get rich from it. You guys are better. Like, YouTube's the way to go.
But what I'm curious about is, where do you start?
Right.
Like, what's the, like, do you go after the interviews with the artists? Do you go after these people over here? Do you talk to someone who worked with the band? Where does it begin? And how does it snowball where others will start to take you seriously?
Right.
Like, what's that route?
That's a great question. I think the thing, if you're Neil Strauss and you have like the endorsement of the band, right, you can call up anybody. Like if you're doing the Motley Crue story, you can call up like, all the guys in Cheap Trick and say, hey, I've got, I'm doing the Motley Crue book, and they're immediately going to talk to you. Right. And so, but in doing the book I was a history professor with an interest in Van Halen. And so I started grassroots, right? I was just talking to locals, talking to guys who had been promoters. I ended up talking to people like, eventually kind of working my way up the food chain, so to speak, talking to like Marshall Burrell, Don Landee, Ted Templeman, talked to Mike Anthony. The last people I asked to talk to was I sent an email to Ed, and his wife at the time, Janie, very politely said, hey, Ed's not going to, whatever, just Ed's not available for interviews. Good luck with your project. She was very polite, very nice. And so that was a pass. And then I ended up sending a message to Roth through his manager, and about 2 weeks went by and I heard a no too. But they were the last of the last, right? I mean, because it was clearly not something where they were never going to like sign on early with an unknown quantity. And I knew those guys, Roth had done his book, and I kind of knew that that point, my understanding was that the brothers were not particularly interested in doing books. That changed, I think, after Ed passed, and Alex wanted to kind of tell his story of his brother, which I'm really glad it was a great read. But so yeah, I mean, at that point, it was just, I had already done 90% of the work on the book, and I honestly had just general questions for those guys, and it would have been great for my project to be like, I interviewed David Lee Roth, like I could say I interviewed Mike Anthony, but I wasn't looking for them to reframe my story at that point, because I had done the work, and sort of in setting it up the way I sort of saw it happening. And again, Alex was going to tell his story his way, and if Mike ever writes a book, that would be fantastic, and he would kind of tell that origin story too his way. But it was my take on what it was based on what I learned through my research and my interviews and stuff.
And you're probably better off, because to your point, had anybody else gotten involved, the book might have been edited a little differently.
Oh, sure.
Right. It's interesting that you then go, obviously there's success with the book, because then you're asked to do the Ted Templeman story, Van Halen's producer. Right. That's a nice jump for you. How did that come about?
Right. Well, it was I actually asked Ted. Yeah. It was like, so Ted, that was one of the more, again, I'm a guy, grew up a Van Halen fan. I was never, had some master plan 20 years ago to write a Van Halen book. It happens, whatever. And so I ended up doing a book event, and I had a friend in Pasadena at Vroman's Books, and that was going to be kind of the book launch in Pasadena. And a friend of mine was talking to him, and I said, "Oh yeah, Ted lives pretty close. I should ask him to come down." He's like, "Why don't you ask him to come up and do the Q&A?" And I was like, "Oh no." And he was like, "Ask." So I'd interviewed Ted a couple of times for the book, and he was great. And I called him up, and I just said, "Hey, I'm doing this book launch. If you want to come down and sign some books and hang out and answer questions, I think people would love that." And he was like, oh yeah. And so it had turned out that Ted had actually worked at Vroman's as a young person. I think he worked either applied for a job or worked there, because he lived in Pasadena. And so he was very familiar with the bookstore, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that sounds like fun. Okay, when?" I told him, and he was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll be there." And he showed up. And so he answered questions and did the videos on YouTube, and just, he hadn't really been out and about in public very much, and had been, he retired as he is, and just, it was just fantastic. And at the end of the night, I just sort of said to him, I said, I kind of like fill myself and be like, "Someone should write your story." And he was like, "Oh no one would ever want to read that." And I was like, "No, I think they would." And he was like, "Okay." And we talked a little bit more about it. And, I think at the beginning, honestly, he kind of thought like, Greg's a nice guy, like his Van Halen book. If he wants to like muck around with this for a couple of, a few weeks and kind of like lose interest, he'll lose interest. And I knew there was a great story there. Ted grew up in Santa Cruz, was kind of a surfer guy, went to college, played jazz, was a bit of a musical prodigy as a kid, and then was in a band called Harper's Bazaar. They had a couple of pop hits in the late 60s, and then he goes to work for Warner Brothers and so on and so forth. And I sort of knew there was an interesting journey there, a life journey of rather being like a guy who just like, joined a band, got signed, and then did the usual rock and roll thing. Ted was a executive for Warner Brothers, and then was a producer, and was a musician, played on a lot of the records he produced. And so I knew that was going to be quite a great story, just beyond the Van Halen part. I mean, he did, like go through Little Feat, Doobie Brothers,
right?
He worked with, and the list is absolutely endless. Yeah. So that whole, that's how that I pitched to him, and I just sort of started building some momentum, and he was like, "Great. Okay." And then he would send me emails, and we would call, and I'd call him up and interview him. And I just kind of kept putting it together. Did a lot of research for that one too, to kind of, fill out things that were just, things he didn't recall in terms of like when that happened. I have to go back and look and sort of to flesh it all out. But it was a great honor, and it was an awesome experience.
Yeah, for sure. I bet. I wonder if, what's your opinion on Ted's greatest contribution to the Van Halen, story, mm-hmm. that fans might not be aware of? I mean, we all know that he was the producer, and, he produced these albums.
Right.
What are some of the things that maybe he's not credited for that he should be?
Sure. That's a great question. I mean, beyond, I think most people knew that, Ted was the guy who went down to the Starwood and saw them. I think the one thing I really tried to emphasize in Van Halen Rising, which I think is very accurate, is that at that point, pretty much every record executive in LA kind of knew about Van Halen, because they had played the whiskey for a long time. And again, this was at a time when, A&R guys sent their assistants down, or they went down, and they sat and they would listen to bands and watch bands and kind of get their, hoping to catch lightning in a bottle and sign sign bands. This went on the Strip, obviously in the 80s, big time. And it was going on in the 70s and even the 60s. And so people knew about Van Halen in the industry. And then Gene had come along, Gene Simmons, and had done a demo with them in New York and finished it off in LA. And then, LA, and then finished it off in New York. And then, he isn't able to get them a deal. And that's detailed in my book. And Gene has talked about this too. Basically, the other guys in Kiss were kind of like, meh, and kind of, it seemed like there was a kind of there was a lot of, I don't want to say collusion, but there was basically like beyond management at Kiss and the other guys at Kiss were not really interested in Gene becoming like the new mogul of Apple Records for Kiss, or like the little boutique label. So they kind of scotched that whole Van Halen thing. So the signing of Van Halen. But I think the other thing that people, which is detailed, I think, pretty well in the Templeman book, is how hard Ted worked arranging with those guys and work with those guys. I mean, good producers do a lot of pre-production work. And Roth had the house in Pasadena that his father owned, and the brothers and Mike and Dave spent a lot of time in the basement of the Pasadena house, the one that Roth still lives in today, the mansion. And Ted lived like minutes away from that house. He had a house in Pasadena too, and he would go over there after he got done at Warner Brothers or working in the studio in Hollywood. He would go and like sit in the basement and listen to the songs. He talked about working with those guys to arrange those songs. One of the things he really loved to talk about was just basically how in sync Ed and Al were, where Ed would play some riff and Mike and Al would be like, oh, what about that other part? And they were like trying to arrange the songs and basically put parts together and maybe change things and like, oh yeah. And like they basically shared the same musical brain, and then Ed would remember and do this thing, and then Alex would play along. So Ted spent a lot of time working with those guys in pre-production. The other thing that Ted did a lot with, Ted was a vocalist in his band Harper's Bazaar and had sort of the trademark of doing harmonies with the doobies and all this stuff. I think he was really somebody who was most responsible for sort of sculpting Roth's vocals on record. So if you listen to the Gene Simmons demo, Roth does some fine performances on there, but really, especially with things like Running with the Devil and sort of I'm the One and some of the other stuff that sort of kind of captures the whole David Lee Roth vocal approach that kind of becomes his trademark. Ted was important for sort of figuring out, I think, as I often explain it to people, just basically telling to Roth, like, don't do that, do this. Like I'd listen to the demos, some of the leaked Van Halen demos with Gene, but also with the stuff that was done with Ted that leaked on bootlegs in the 90s. And Ted would just say that was like flat out unacceptable. And he wasn't like trying to trash Roth, because like that's the type of stuff that would, like, Roth was trying to hit something. And he's like, it doesn't sound good. Like he just needed somebody to basically coach him. So I think there was a lot of work done with Roth, probably less work done with Ed in terms of like in the studio, like Ed and Don Landee really hit it off. And so Ted spent a lot of time working with Dave. And in fact, he often talked about, which again, I really admire Roth. Like basically there was parts that they need to redo. They were going to their comp parts together, and like they would send, Roth would stay and he'd send the other guys home. He'd just be like, oh, we're done. And like Roth, he's like, Dave, you stay. And like they would work alone at Sunset, listening, playing back and just working on, this is the melody you want for tomorrow, whatever he wanted him to do to sort of like prep him. And he told me he had the other guys leave because he's like, he didn't want the other guys to see him struggling. Basically, he wanted to give Roth the ability to kind of be, coach him in private, basically, to be like, get him ready, like prep him up. Like, so like, you're not seeing like an actor's first rehearsal. So when he was in the studio with the guys the next day, he'd be ready to go and working really hard to try to make that, that all work together. So I think that would be one thing. And, Roth and Ted really had also a very similar mind with lyrics. So, a lot of the lyrics and songs. So one of the great stories is something, like when they were going to do, Good, or these other songs that sort of got to be kind of dicey with the brothers and with the cover songs later. But basically, more than Ed and Al, Roth and Ted had the same sort of Motown early musical education, where they had that sort of early 60s radio songs in their mind, and sort of the harmonies and the stuff as Roth has talked about so eloquently about, like, Van Halen is like basically putting the harmonies of the Temptations on top of like Black Sabbath, basically, is like what he said, like, tongue in cheek. But Ted really knew that song craft, and like they were able to sort of connect on those, like knowing the same parts and songs, and because the songs got poppier. I mean, they really did. And a lot of the last thing I'd say that Ted did too is, like, if you listen to 25 song demo, which is on YouTube and it's been leaked a number of times. A lot of them were like dirgy, heavy metalists. There's songs like Light in the Sky and these other songs that really never made records. They were much more like Ted got rid of all that stuff and just basically said like, yeah, we want some stuff to be like atomic punk and be aggressive, but he wanted it to be like, as he said, a sun-kissed pop sound, like the Beach Boys harmonies over heavy metal. That's what Ted saw, and that's what he had tried to do with Montrose. Not as maybe heavily with the harmonies, but he wanted to make pop friendly at what the time would have been called heavy metal. Like I always stress this to people. It's like at the time, 1976, Blue Oyster Cult was heavy metal. Like there's like that was it. Like people were like,
it's true.
Why did you call the book Saving Heavy Metal? It wasn't. They're not heavy metal. Well, 1976. If you look on Circus Magazine, they were saying Van Halen's heavy metal, Kiss is heavy metal. Ted wanted to make, and really that he was the one who I think, along with Roth, but particularly saw like, let's really streamline the songs, like maybe cut Ed solos down a little bit, just make it more pop friendly for the radio. Dance the Night Away. This other stuff is kind of the ultimate of that type of stuff. But that was really Ted's contributions.
Let me ask you this. I've always been curious about this. The word is when they were recording that first Van Halen record, Ted Templeman wasn't completely sold on Dave Lee Roth. And rumor has it he was actually talking about Sammy Hagar, which 10 years later became a reality.
Right.
Ted produced Sammy's solo record, VOA. And I guess what I've always been curious about was when Dave and Van Halen parted ways, Ted went with Dave, which was a shock to me that he didn't stay with Van Halen. And why did that come about? Why did that happen? Was their bond that tight? From the things you're telling me, they hung out in the studio themselves, and there was a trust factor there and guidance. And was there tension between Ted and Van Halen after that? Were they ever in communication or anything of the sort that you know of?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll start with the Sammy thing. So what Ted told me, and it's in the Templeman memoir, is that he loved when he saw Van Halen in the club. He really, really loved them. But when he got them in the studio a few months later, and he really heard Dave under the microscope of a studio microphone, like there's no escaping from that in the demos. He was just like, I don't know. He was like, I don't know. He felt there was just, he just didn't know if it was the right fit. Now, Ted is told, the way Ted always told the story was like that basically he may have whispered this to Don Landee, the late engineer who was such an amazing part of the Van Halen story and just passed away. But he never told the brothers, and he never told Mike and he never told Dave because he didn't want to like have that sort of like negative impact on the band. Ted said that, soon enough he figured out within like whatever, going back to the basement, working with those guys, that how brilliant Roth was. And he sort of saw the raw materials there to work with. And again, what I talked about already, which is sort of like, okay, stop doing this and you're going to do this. And we're going to work on sort of accentuating your strengths. So he said he sort of like tossed that idea out. Now, I think the thing is the brothers did know about that. I'll jump ahead and I'll jump back. The brothers did know about that because when Van Halen split, they often talked about that in Circus Magazine. Like, yeah, we should have just gotten Sammy back in 1978 or whatever. So I suspect that Don probably told them at some point along the way that he had mentioned that. Maybe even after like they split, he may have mentioned, I don't know when exactly that came about that he told them, but the brothers did know. But Ted, to be clear, Ted said he would have been making one of the biggest, probably he said like the biggest mistake in rock history, that he just said it wouldn't have worked with Sammy then. The irony is that Ted opposed Sammy joining Van Halen in 1985 and was like pretty vocal about that. But in terms of the difficulties, I think one of the things that ended up happening, there were troubles making Fair Warning, and I mean troubles insofar as that from what I remember from talking to Don, who had passed away, and a little bit of a Ted about this, is that just basically there was Ted didn't, I think, the records had been declining in sales. Like basically the records had been kind of tearing down. And I think there was sort of a sense among Ted that he really wanted to try to direct those guys towards being more commercial. And Ed at that time was really, especially the stuff on Fair Warning, it's much more dark and much more, there's really not a great single. I mean, we all love Unchained, but Unchained was not going to play on AM radio in 1981, right? Just it's not like a Dance the Night Away. It's not Pretty Woman. It wasn't that type of single. And so there was definitely some tension between Ed and Ted at that point. And so that really was what kind of started to spark the thinking, I think, in Ed's mind about building a studio. The way I was told the story was that initially they really just wanted to have basically Don and Ed wanted to build a demo studio in Ed's backyard, thinking that if we can present really well-crafted demos from like studio quality demos to Ted, we might have a better case and sort of like making, again, not wanting to split with Ted at this time, but they wanted to make the case for Ed's vision for songs. But as the studio was built and it sounded so great, and this is late 1982, early 1983, they pitched the idea to Ted to doing the record there, and Ted agrees, and they agree to do the record in Ed's backyard. But what it really, I think, ended up happening was there was if you make a record in your backyard, right, it's your playground, it's your sandbox. And I think a lot of that was sort of like this. Don Landy, as I mentioned, was their engineer, was basically living there, around the clock, and they would do a lot of work when Ted wasn't around, which Ted was okay with. But I think the sort of like Ted as the arbiter of things, ultimately Ted realized that things were sort of slipping away, and there was a lot of just sort of which Ted would say in retrospect was just sort of a disconnect, maybe caused by substances and other stuff that's sort of like, Ted's trying to stop us from do this or doing that. And really, Ted's whole point was that when something like Jump came along, Ted talked about how at first he was like, I don't know, it's a good song, but I don't know if Van Halen should be putting this out as a Van Halen branded song. Ted's position on that kind of, I think, gets misconstrued. Like Ted was always kind of like, I didn't like it. And I think what he means is I didn't like it for Van Halen. Like, he's like, he could recognize that it was catchy, right? He was like, but I didn't know if those guys should like do that much of a shift. So I think that probably offended Ed. And again, all these songs like I'll Wait, that Ted was very lukewarm on, Jump, which Ted's favorite joke about that is that he told Ed that it sounded like something you'd be played in like Dodger Stadium. So like, da, 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 like that. And so like, and then he's like, sounds like you'd be playing in a stadium, and they must have had some sort of disagreement about that. Well,
listen, Jump is a long way from Unchained, right? Like
right. And then 5 years, and then like whatever, a year later, like Ted is I don't know if he will, but he on the TV or on Dodger Stadium, he's like, they're playing Jump, and he's like, I was right. It was a difficult split for Ted. He had discovered the band and produced their records, and it was pretty clear that it was probably best that those guys go in a different direction. It's a longer story. I mean, it's a long ass story about how all that went down, which is, I think, detailed accurately in the book. But yeah, he ended up going with Dave. And the thing I would say too is that there was this sort of mythology that there was like this deep hatred, like and again, I'm not doubting that the brothers were pissed off at Ted, and I'm not doubting that Ted was pissed off at the brothers or whatever. But when they went to sequence 5150, Don Landy, their engineer, and Ed and probably Al went to Ted's office at Warner Brothers, and they listened to the songs, and Ted like helped sequence them. He's an executive at Warner Brothers. It wasn't like he was like, get those guys the fuck out of here. I'm not seeing, it wasn't like that. But it was definitely a sad thing for Ted. I mean, he was just, he loved, as he said, loved the original Van Halen. That was one of the reasons why, which was so awkward in some ways. So, which also made this more complicated, was that the initial thought was like, well, we've got Sammy. You basically, I don't know, discovered Montrose, basically, like signed Montrose. You were the one who basically did their first record, which is a classic, and were the first vocalist. It was the first vocalist of Montrose for the first two records, which Ted produced. Ted was working with Sammy, and like why would you not want that? But Ted's position was that, to me, it was the original. I'm kind of putting words in Ted's mouth, but it'd be like, oh, we're going to replace Robert Plant with somebody. We're going to replace Robert Plant with Ian Gillan. Like, it's not Led Zeppelin anymore. I'm sorry, it's not. And that was Ted's position on that. And that ended up being kind of an impasse that was, I don't know. I don't want to say got toxic. That's an over exaggeration probably, but it was just like, they just didn't see eye to eye about that. And of course, Sammy was pissed off, obviously. It's like, you're like, I thought we were friends, and now you're like, like you're basically like trying to like, basically not put the endorsement on this new version of Van Halen. But that was, I mean, I don't know if I answered the whole question, but that's basically the whole thing. It's
side note, after producing Eat 'Em and Smile, Ted did not hop on Skyscraper. Was that Dave saying, I want to take the reins on this one with Steve Vai, or did Ted offer his services and was declined? What happened there? Do you know?
Yeah, that was, so I'm going back in my memory banks about how all that went down. I know that Ted passed up on it at that time. Ted had done with Mirrors, right? He'd done Eat 'Em and Smile, and he'd done with Mirrors with Aerosmith. He was in the running to do the Aerosmith follow up, which ended up not happening. He and Kolodner didn't see eye to eye, and I think Kolodner was just sort of like, yeah, we need something different. It didn't work with Done with Mirrors. And then there was it's escaping my brain. What was the other? Ted passed up on something that was a fairly significant project because he's like, no, I'm doing the album with Roth. And as Ted tells the story, it's not very doesn't really shine the best light on Roth, but he went to like Roth's office basically and be like, hey, when are we going to get started? And Ted's like, basically after all these records, he's like, well, I'm going in a different direction. I don't need your services anymore. So Ted was obviously pretty pissed off about that. And Steve and Dave decided to produce Skyscraper. Billy left as well around that time. I'm not sure exactly when Billy left, but I think after the recording session, Billy Sheehan left. But that was a surprise to Ted, and he had, I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth to say that he really felt like he had basically gone to bat for Dave a lot of times at Warner Brothers with just stuff like the EP, like everything like that had worked out well. But basically, he had always been there to sort of help promote and basically support Dave and his creative endeavors, and basically had obviously sided with Dave during the whole split. But that was what that's what happened. And then they did Skyscraper without him, which I think that's up to the public to decide. I'm not a big fan of Skyscraper, but that's what ended up happening. Steve and I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is if you listen to Skyscraper, you can really hear Steve and Dave did like an enormous amount of layering of tracks, right? Whereas like with Eat 'Em and Smile, it's basically like one guitar, bass, drums, just the original like Van Halen formula, which is very few overdubs, relatively live takes, and just sort of raw, in your face rock and roll, which is what Ted did with Done with Mirrors too, by the way. But that was just a different approach, and I think it was just a surprise to Ted, and he was blindsided by it, and as I said, had passed up. I can't remember the name of the band, which band he passed up. But it was a fairly big project that would have been, basically being left with nothing, right?
Sure.
He passed off thinking that they were going to start.
And then I think he went on to produce, if I'm not mistaken, the Bullet Boys.
Correct.
Debut.
He did like Honeymoon Suite and stuff like that. He did the Bullet Boys debut. So that's an interesting story because at the time, Ted's sister was an A&R rep at Warner Brothers, and she's the one who actually, Ted's younger sister was an A&R rep, and did she had helped sign Devo and Dire Straits. She had a very, very successful career, and she was the one who kind of put Bullet Boys on his radar, and they did that, and that was engineered by Jeff Hendrickson, who I'm a big fan of. Jeff did that when he did the Cheap Trick, Woke Up with a Monster. Mm-hmm. He did a bunch of other things. He did Eat 'Em and Smile. He did VOA. So when Ted and Don Landee split in terms of working together, Jeff became Ted's right-hand man, and that is an incredible sounding record. And they got the right man for the job for that one, for sure. That was like the right guy for that.
I can remember hearing that or seeing the video for the first Bullet Boys single and being like, who is trying to cop Van Halen this week? Like this,
right. They went all in.
That singer's back then.
They went all in. Yeah,
they really did.
All in.
But interesting that you bring up the whole Skyscraper thing. I think that record was a product of the times. Eat 'Em and Smile was pretty raw sounding and very Ted Templeman-esque in terms of the production. And Eat 'Em and Skyscraper, quite the opposite. But if we all recall at the time, bigger was better back then, layers upon layers. And also, as far as a producer goes, the first, I don't want to say rookie mistake you make, but usually more is better. Let's layer.
Let's keep adding more tracks.
Sounds better. But as a producer, as a seasoned producer, that's not always. Sometimes that's the way to go, but not always the way to go.
Right.
And it was a much different sound for Roth, and for better or worse, you get Skyscraper because of it. But interesting, let's sort of step away and step back a little bit and come out from under the microscope and go onto a broader sort of subject for you as a Van Halen fan, and for someone who has really, you really are the consummate expert in terms of the history of this band. If you, as the fan, could go back to any period or era of the band or album or tour, where would you want to be a fly on the wall? Where would you, what's the most interesting era to you or moment in the band's history that you'd really like to know more about?
Well, okay, I'll take the esoteric one first, the one that's not going to be on anybody's radar. But I would have liked to have been in the car leaving LAX when they got back from New York after they hadn't gotten the deal with Gene. Like, I can just imagine, right, that was the disappointment there must have been absolutely, stunning. I don't know. It's, excuse me. It's like being like a 12-point favorite in the Super Bowl. And you're like, oh, this definitely going to work for us. Right. We're going to win. And then you're like, what do you mean? Like, we've lost and like we have nothing. And so just to, I actually interviewed the guy who actually picked them up at the airport and drove them back. It was one of Roth's friends from high school. And he was like, yeah, in the book you read about it, he's like, basically like, the brothers were pretty despondent. Ross was basically like, it's not over. Like, it's, it's going to work. And like, basically like kind of pumping those guys up to be like, it's just incredible, right? To go from that level of disappointment and still have your, David Lee Roth there as sort of like being like Mr. Optimism, being like, we're going to break through. And it did happen. But you can imagine the devastation of thinking like, okay, at the time, Gene Simmons is, it's 1976, one of the biggest rock stars in the world. I mean, there's like, Kiss is like absolutely at the pinnacle of their success. Sure. And if Gene Simmons can't get you a record deal, no one's going to get you a record deal in theory. Like who's Gene Simmons was not just said like, made a call to a record company, actually like recorded your demo, personally was advocating for it. And again, there's a bigger story right there. That was basically, Gene didn't go like, obviously Gene didn't shop the demo. He didn't go to like every record company in America, try to shop it. But basically, after the in-house Kiss thing didn't work out for wanting to sign bands, he just basically tore up their contract. To his credit, tore up their contract and said, you guys are on your own, go for it, do whatever you want with the tape and good luck. And that was really speaks well to Gene. He didn't take like, 20% of their future earnings or something like that. And, but I would have loved to have
for all that can be said about Gene, right?
No, I mean, 100%. I mean, it's like actually like there are, we all know the stories, right, of guys who own a piece of certain bands and their albums come out, and that's kind of the way business was done. But for me, I always, on Twitter, I still do it to an extent, but I used to do it a lot of time as partially as a bit, but actually I really think is like the Diver Down gets a unfair. I wish I had seen the Diver Down tour. I mean, I really like Diver Down. I like Diver Down, and again, people are like, it's the worst Roth Van Halen record, and maybe it is to them. But to me, it just shows the diversity of the group. The fact that they could do like a Western, a Western a cappella thing. They could do just, the incredible instrumentals, the amazing instrumentals that were done there. I know
jazz, like
the big band jazz, and I know the story of how the album was made as well as anybody. I understand that, at the time. The brothers spoke well about the record. They want to sell the record. You're not going to come out and go, our record, we're pissed off about all the cover songs. They're going to say it's a good record. Right. But I do think that over time, that sort of became emblematic of like, we put up with Roth, we put up with, to a lesser extent, with Ted's meddling in our vision. And, I think that was one of the things that the brothers kind of harped on is sort of, to basically like, oh, we're going to kick that record as the David Lee Roth emblematic of what we dealt with as the problems. Where I really, again, I really love the record, and I think it's it always puts me in a good mood. And I always think like, damn, this band is just brilliant. It just shows that, like you said, like they could do a song with their dad playing clarinet, and it still sounds like Van Halen. Like and the thing is, like, we don't have to get into the details on this, but like I've heard other bands we try to do stuff like that on their records, and it just doesn't work. Like Zeppelin could do that. Like sometimes it just feels like there's no welds, there's no seams. Like whatever they do, it's like all streamlined and all part of the Van Halen thing, like all part of the Zeppelin thing. Then you hear other bands do it and you're like, man, that's don't do that ever again. Like don't try to do like a rockabilly song. Like, again, they could have done a rockabilly song for sure. And like it would have made it sound like Van Halen. But other bands try to do like, oh, we'll do this little left turn on our record and like get outside of our wheelhouse. And it's like, no, just stick with your thing, because you're not that good. Right.
It's a real testament to their time spent as bar bands, where they were doing all of these different covers.
Correct.
And you then bring in all of the Roth, inspirational songs that no one's ever heard of, Ice Cream Man and Big Bad Bill, and these songs that like, where are you finding these covers?
Right.
But you throw in Eddie behind one of those songs, Dancing in the Street. Is there a better cover ever? than dancing in the street.
People hate that song, and I absolutely love it. I mean, I think it's like a Van Halen disco song, and like you listen to Mike's bass line, he does like disco runs in that. Even like Intruder, that was recorded. All this talk about whatever Mike didn't play on this, Mike didn't play on that, but that was recorded live in the studio. Roth played keyboards on that. They recorded it live in the studio, and again, it's not like super complicated, but like Roth played the keyboards, Ed was playing the Schlitz malt liquor slide guitar. That's like just brilliant. Like that's just brilliant shit that you can't. It's gone. Like you can't get that stuff no more. You can't. It's like that was the stuff to me that, again, for what it is, I'm glad they did that record instead of like basically, because they could have, honestly, what never made any sense to me about that whole period of time is that, and Noel's passed away, but why they just didn't say to Warner Brothers, like, F you, we're not giving you a record. Like, it wasn't like Warner Brothers is like, we're dropping Van Halen. Like,
Right.
no, I mean, like, no, you're not going to drop Van Halen. You're not going to drop one of your most successful bands. I mean, if they just basically put your foot down, I don't know what the leverage was or why that they gave, because they always talk about how they didn't want to go on tour and they didn't want to do this, and I'm glad we got that fifth Van Halen record. My point is, instead of like being pushed off to what became 1984, because that was what was coming down the pike or whatever, really, in terms of the keyboard stuff. But it just, I just think it's, it just really, yes, exactly. Their versatility. Again, am I gonna like gun to my head be like tell you it's like a better record than Fair Warning? No, but like at the end of the day, like I love Diver Down.
It's so interesting. We've talked about Diver Down, Tommy and I, many times, and I've always found just to kind of cap this off, for such a bad period of time in the band where there was the most friction going on, it's the happiest sounding album, right? It's got the most sunshine in it, right? You put that album on, the sun is shining somehow,
Yeah, it's just that's the thing too. It's interesting too, because I do really want to again emphasize to people that just from Ted's perspective, which doesn't mean that's the perspective that Alex and Ed and like the guys would care about or would not be like annoyed about at the time, was that he's a Warner Brothers senior vice president. His job is to sell records. Right. So you have something like Fair Warning, which we all love, right? But So This Is Love is not a great single. It's a great rock and roll song. It's a great, like, basically Grand Funk revisited song. It's awesome. Unchained, not a great rock radio single. It's not gonna go top 40. It's just not. And so from Ted's perspective, he's like, I'm looking at this band that has the sales are declining and declining and declining, and we need to basically turn that around. And that was really one of the things was like, oh, let's do Pretty Woman, let's do Dancing in the Streets, so we can have songs. They would rush this album out. I'm sure if they had more time, Eddie could have come up with something poppier and catchier. But that was basically Ted's thinking, was that we need something that's going to get on the radio. And the tour sold extremely well. The album did fine. And again, I understand it sort of creatively, they felt like we have good songs, plus the whole royalties thing, which is another interesting thing. Like, you're doing someone else's song, you're basically like filling someone else's bank account with publishing money rather than your own, which I understand, understandably so, would piss me, in retrospect, I'd be pissed off about that too. But that was the thinking behind the record, is to sort of make it have some pop songs. You can still have your Secrets, which is a more moody moody type of song. Hang 'em High, you have the barn burning songs, and but I gotta be pop songs.
To Ted's credit, though, you gotta kind of give him some credit for letting the band do Women and Children First without a pop hit, letting them do, Ted let Fair Warning happen without saying, hey guys, we really need a hit here. Like, he let them be, which is the sign of a great producer more than a good producer. A good producer will get you hits, but a great producer will let the artist sort of evolve. Right.
And that leads me a quick side note, which is, of course, the thing that Ted talked about quite a bit, was like, for all the flack that Ted took about 1984 and the aftermath, with the sort of just basically like a lot of this was the real vision we wanted, and luckily Ted wasn't able to meddle the way he wanted at the end. Ted's like, I didn't like I'll Wait, but I wanted to make sure it got in the record, so I'm the one who basically said, let's call Michael McDonald to get him to finish the song. And like, I think that story is worth telling really quickly, which is that the way Ted tells the story is that Ed and Al had this keyboard thing that they loved. They loved this, like this, what was I'll Wait, but it was, Dave couldn't come up with the lyrics and a melody, right? So that's the thing. It's like Ted always talked about. If you can't come up with a vocal part, you can't just put instrumentals on records, right? It's like, it's
not a song. It's just music.
It's not a song. It's just a musical idea. So they had this musical idea they really liked, and so Dave was like, I'm stumped. And Ed and Al really were like adamant they wanted it on the record, and so he said, let's call Michael McDonald. And then Michael McDonald, Ted, and Dave went into Ted's office at Warner Brothers, and Mike came up with the part. And Don Landee told me himself that the tape, cassette tape, came to 5150. Ted brought it, and they played it back, and it was Michael McDonald singing the chorus for "I'll Wait." He'd come up with the chorus and like that phrase "I'll wait." And Don's perspective, like Don's like, that's it. We can finish the song. But apparently, there was definitely some. The brothers were not quite as enthusiastic about having an outsider participate in the song. But to Ted's perspective, he's like, they wanted the song on the record, so I call up the world's greatest songwriter. Like basically, I call this guy up who's like
Grammy-winning
top tier world songwriter, to be like, finish the song and help get the song finished. And then I'm like the bad guy, right? And again, I'm sure Alex, if he was here, would tell the story differently, and whatever. I understand. I don't mean to diss anyone else's perspective on it. I wasn't there, but that's the way Ted told it to me, and just basically he's like, it's like, I didn't even like the song, and I fought to get it on the record, basically. So
that's awesome. Hey, what part of the Van Halen story do you think fans still do not fully understand? Is there anything that comes to mind? This could be a whole other episode.
In our next episode, we'll do a deep dive on that one.
Stay tuned to be continued.
I think what people don't understand, and I don't think I understand. I mean, I'm not 100% sure I really understand, why. Basically what went wrong with Roth in 96 with the coming of Sharon and all that stuff. That's sort of, we have sort of like those Dave and Ed's perspective, but I would love to hear Mike's perspective on that. Like, I just as a more neutral party to be like, okay, I think he's probably talked about it in passing, but Mike's savvy. He just says this thing and he just gets it out there, but he doesn't he doesn't contradict anybody, which I respect. But I would love to hear a sort of somewhat objective third party talking about what went on with that whole period of time. Because it's just, it's just,
it's a great answer. You're right. What's interesting about what you just said is all of us who are fans of Van Halen definitely remember the moment when they reunited on MTV. It was iconic when they walked out. Right. And watching it, I remember just oh my God, I was standing in my living room as everyone was standing in the auditorium.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's incredible.
And what was wild is you'll watch it. And I remember watching it going, I don't know. Something's weird here. They're not
right. The body language is weird.
The body language. Exactly.
Standing off to the side. Right.
Yeah. Right. And I couldn't put it together then. And hindsight is always 20/20. So when things started to, unravel and you look back at it now with different eyes, you're like, oh, well, that's why that guy's right. It's just so, man, it was just, I get mad at that moment actually, because that's when they should have made the record. It really, that was that was an important moment in Van Halen history. And
we're going to have to calm Tommy down. We're going to have to take 5.
No, it really makes me mad.
A minute, everybody.
It didn't quite.
Greg, I get really angry at this.
My tweet didn't quite do as well as some of the other great ones with the Truman Show meme, which has gone around with the guy, with Ed Harris going now have this happen. It's I was bring him out on stage with Van Halen on the MTV Music Awards. Now get Gary Sharon ready to be the singer. That's what it was like. It was wait, what?
Yeah.
You know what, Greg? I don't want to interrupt you, but one thing I've always said, Gary Sharon did not replace Sammy Hagar. People say that all the time. It's not true. He replaced David Lee Roth, and that moment was where it happened.
Yeah, it's and again, to Gary's credit, Gary has really been very reticent about that. I don't think I just think he's just not interested in revisiting that, other than just say it was an honor, had a great time, kind of, and I respect that, right? There's no benefit for him to do that, but it was all fun. No, it's just all that whole thing, and then the other thing too is Mike Post, the producer of Van Halen 3, gave an interview fairly recently, and I think it was a non-music or maybe it was a music podcast actually, where he just basically, kind of said I let Eddie do his thing, and it just, listening to Van Halen 3, there are so many things that I just am puzzled by. I'm sure you guys are what was the thinking behind this? Even very, even Without You, a song I actually like, which is a song when I listen to Van Halen 3, which, that's the song I would listen to. The solo to me is too long, and it just is like puzzling to me where like a guy like Mike Post, who is, I mean, presume, great songwriter, obviously very experienced, was brought in to produce the record and just seems to have just been like, almost like whatever you do is fine. I'll just sign. And so it didn't, for all the problems with Templeman and with Andy Johns, these other guys who were there, they definitely had opinions and definitely voiced it in terms of being like saying like, I don't think this is going to work or whatever the words would be. The stuff they did with Erwin Musper sounds incredible. They did for the best of volume collection. I mean, those all, but to me, it just seemed like there was just, I don't know, where Eddie wasn't hearing things the right way. And it just seemed like he was the one sort of steering the ship. And again, was his creative vision. He wanted it out, but it just, as a record, it just didn't work as a record. It just doesn't. Not
the most cohesive record, for sure. Hey, so Greg, one last question.
Sure.
Before we let you go, before I even ask the question, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
It's been fun.
You can rest assured you're going to see an email coming in from us any day now for part 2, because
yes, for sure.
You've clearly got much more to say, and we definitely want to hear it, because I'm hanging on every word. I'm just staying as quiet as possible, just hanging on every single word. You've got me. So before we let you go, is there anything new you're working on? What's your latest project?
Okay, great question. So I am finishing up a proposal for a book on the first Bad News Bears movie.
Oh, that's awesome.
So
that's awesome.
Right on.
Yeah.
And why that? What made you choose that?
There's a whole nother episode of that. No, for
Noel
me,
Monk came in.
It was. I saw it in the theaters in 1976. My father brought me to all sorts of movies I probably shouldn't have seen. I was young. I was like 7 or 8 years old, and that one was like pretty. He took me to see Deer Hunter, which the end of that will literally blow anybody's mind forever. Like, not for children. I don't care. And it's and I always loved it. I played Little League Baseball, and I just really think it's emblematic of an era and a time that's long gone in America, and has a lot to say about.
For sure.
Without getting into it, it's just about competition and about the sports dads and about travel football today, and just all the stuff that we think is like, sort of related to our own time. It was all sort of very well done by the director there, Michael Ritchie, who kind of like talked about this like misfit team of kids who weren't any good, who were the bums basically, who got mocked and basically refused to fold up and quit and just went out there and tried. And so there's a lot of interesting stories about the movie and its casting and just about its legacy. Very quickly, I would just say like Mighty Ducks, The Sandlot. There was a whole host of movies that came later, which basically was just like, let's just do the same, like copy the Bad News Bears in some way. So it's a very influential movie as well.
Very cool.
I just want to say to all the Van Halen fans out there, make sure you pick up Greg's books. They're awesome. Van Halen Rising and Ted Templeman's autobiography. And Greg, listen, historian, author. There's one thing I think you need to add to your resume, and that's private investigator. You are a detective who tracks down the guy who picked up Van Halen at the airport after failing to get their record deal in New York. But I would hire you to track down anyone. Like I can't even imagine how you even do anything.
It's just all word of mouth. I mean, that was really what it was, and that's really, again, I'll close with that. I mean, anyone's doing a project like that. I mean, it's like, you're not going to be able to Google your way to those types of people. You just have to like talk to people on the phone, and they'd be like, hey, you talk to my friend Steve, he did this, or hey, these were, that's what it really was. It was, and again, we talked about this to kind of bring it full circle. It's about building trust with people when you do a project like this, and just to make sure people know you're not in for, fly by night or just in for it the wrong reasons. That I loved the band, and I do love the band, and I do books on things I love and care about. And so that's really when people realize that you're invested in it and you care about their story. Because I did. I really wanted to hear like, holy shit, you hired Van Halen to play in your backyard and 600 people came and a helicopter flew over and shined the spotlight. Like that literally happened. And like you heard these stories from multiple people and you're like, fuck.
That's amazing.
We missed it. We missed it.
In the 70s.
In the 70s. In prime Dazed and Confused time, man. That was
sounds like an episode of Chips. But Greg, thanks again for being here, man.
Hey, my pleasure, guys. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
And listen, but we always sign off by saying 2 words, and I want you to join us in saying these 2 words, and they're happy trails. So at the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Happy trails.
Trails.
Bombadita. Thanks
Take
again,
care, everybody.
See you soon.